The session are the personal opinions of the participants and do not reflect the official policy or position of their respective employers. This discussion is a volunteer-led effort to contribute to the profession and pay forward the many kindnesses and instances of support and guidance that the participants have received in the course of their career. So we are all paying it forward. Thank you, everybody. David, John, and Suzanne on this talk about how to collect incident data, how to use it, how to use VERIS for performing certain actions that you want so that you can share this data anonymously with other people and join the VERIS community. John, do you want to please introduce yourself?
Yep. Hello. Oh, sure, absolutely. So good evening, folks, or good morning or good afternoon. John Grimm here. I'm with Verizon, and I'm a big fan of VERIS and looking forward to a great session today to discuss how we can use VERIS to share information in light of some of the more significant events that you can see within the title here that have impacted folks around the world. So looking forward to a great discussion with my colleagues.
Thank you. Suzanne, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Suzanne Widup, and I am one of the co-authors of the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, or DBIR for short. And VERIS, of course, is what underpins the DBIR and is how we codify all of the data.
And David is joining us from Denmark. Thank you, David, for joining us at this late hour. Then can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. No problem. Thank you, David Thejl-Clayton. I'm connecting in from Denmark, where it's 11 o'clock or 2 minutes past 11 right now. I'm working at a company called Compitech, and I have had quite a lot of experiences with VERIS. I recently gave a SANS talk. What was it? I think in February this year, about how we've used VERIS in the past and how VERIS can be used to, really explode your incident reporting as an organization. So hopefully we can have some good talk about this tonight.
Sure. John, do you want to share your screen?
I do, absolutely. So David, we're really excited. I did see your SANS discussion earlier this year covering VERIS, and I know you've done at least one podcast on how to roll your own DBIR. So very exciting to hear your experiences in those sessions, as well as to hear what you have to say tonight. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Are we okay?
Mm-hmm. We can see it.
Okay. So, Nilofer, did you want to kick things off?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So let me go ahead and kick things off here to kind of give folks an idea of what VERIS is, and we'll walk through different aspects of VERIS in today's discussion with insights from David, from Suzanne, and even you, Nilofer, and myself too, in terms of how we've used VERIS and how it can be effective for various different usages to include understanding the data breach investigations report in terms of its findings. So real quick, Suzanne, do you mind covering this slide right here in terms of the VERIS framework?
Sure. So if you aren't familiar with VERIS, it stands for the Vocabulary for Event Recording and Incident Sharing. And it's really what makes the DBIR possible. It's very good at taking a narrative like a case report and putting it into the format of who is perpetrating these breaches, what kinds of tactics they like to use when they attack, what sort of infrastructure they like to attack, and how it is affected by their actions, the CII triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Okay, and if folks are interested in following along, there's a link down there, veriscommunity.net, where there's all kinds of great information in terms of VERIS. We'll also provide at the end of the session a link to GitHub in terms of additional resources for VERIS. So VERIS in action. Suzanne, do you mind covering this one as well?
Sure. So, we at the DBIR, we try to make it really easy for our partners to give us data. And so we'll take it in whatever format they actually give it to us in. But once we get it, we have to sort of put it into an apples to apples coherent data set. And we use VERIS for that. Now we're frequently asked if we can share the data that underpins the DBIR. And of course, that's shared with us under NDA. And so in 2014, we realized, or 2013, I think, we realized that there's a need for this kind of raw, freely downloadable data set for security research. And we started the VERIS database community database project, which is VCDB. And what we do is we collect publicly disclosed data breach reports, news reports, the things that the companies provide, reports to the government, all that sort of thing, code it up in VERIS format and release it to the public for use. Right now, there's well over 8,000 records in that data set. It's been used for a number of research projects already, and it's really useful as a complementary data set to the DBIR.
So David, you had covered, you had done an assessment or looked at various different models in terms of usage for threat intelligence. In terms of VCDB and VERIS in general, do you mind sharing some of your experiences in terms of researching for solutions for codifying incidents, for example?
Yeah, for sure. I stumbled upon VERIS as an accident, actually. We had the problem at our company of my manager, he got promoted to being a vice president, and then he realized that he left a gap in his position. So I stepped in to be, take over his position. And then the classic thing when he became a VP was he turned around to me and said, I need better reporting. I was okay, how do you want me to do that? And he was like, I just do it. Just give me better reporting.
Just get it done, right?
Vice president stuff, right? I spent some time doing research into, we've got all these incidents, and the tool that we were using, the way that we were recording the incidents was we just didn't really have a very good format, right? We were doing like per incident based reporting. We would have an incident of a certain size, and then we would write a PDF report, and then that would be it. And we wouldn't really be sure of the language we were using in the report, and so then we ended up with we could have 10 PDFs of different reports that essentially explain the same thing, but we didn't really have a good idea of how to link them together. So I started doing quite a lot of research into it, and there are a few people who have come into this problem before and then have produced their own format to doing it. So some of the guys who are incident response teams in Europe, places like Circle, they have a way of their constituents being able to report incidents to them. So they can, you can click on a link and say report incident, and then it takes you through to a site where you can just type in this data. And then I'm good friends with the guys at Circle. They're the guys who also produce MISP as well. And I asked them, how are you then, recording the data afterwards so you can then present it afterwards? And they showed me their model. And I was like, but this is, this only has a few fields. Like in my mind, what I'm looking for is a way of producing metrics from almost every single piece of the incident. Like every single thing could be a metric. And the languages I looked at the time were, the one from Circle, and then I think First has one as well. Mm-hmm. And they were kind of like purpose built for that purpose that they needed them at the time, but they hadn't really thought about, how is this going to improve an organization's security posture, or how is it going to, how are you going to produce heat maps of if you make a change here and seeing how it affects incidents later? How can you do all of that stuff where you literally just in this archaic form where you report a specific incident type, and that was really all you had to move around in. I think there were about 4 metrics that I could kind of dig out of a few of the different reporting languages. Mm-hmm. And I actually got really, really tired. And I went to a first incident response summit in Oslo, and I bumped into Andras, who's one of the lead developers at Circle, who works on the MISP project stuff, and had a chat with him, and he was like, "Why don't you go and look in the MISP taxonomies, because MISP have tried to collect like basically every single incident classification taxonomy that there is out there into MISP, so you can actually go and you can play around with all of them." Mm-hmm. And this still the same prevailing thing that I found each time was that they were kind of, you know, purpose built, like again, kind of built by incident responders for incident responders, and that meant that they'd use their own language, and they hadn't really thought about how this might then land on a vice president's desk or on a CEO's desk, or, you know, all of that type of thing. And I was close to kind of basically saying, okay, I'm going to have to roll my own, right? I'm going to have to create my own thing out of this. And then by chance, you guys published the next iteration of the DBIR, and then I got that, and I was sat there, and I was like, okay, hang on, how have they done this, right? Like, they have made a metric out of everything. Mm-hmm. So how can I do that? And then that's when I stumbled across the VaRS community page, and actually, I think the certificate had expired on one of the forms. And I was like, is this for real? Like, am I on a fake site here or something? Like, what is this? Like, is this part of Verizon? Like, would Verizon have a site that did this? And then, like, after I started digging and talking with a few of the guys behind the scenes, you know, Alex and Gade as well, then I realized that, you know, it was for real, and this was a language that we could use. And then, yeah, sorry, I've talked a lot on that question, but yeah, that was where the research went. And then I was like, I've cracked it. I found exactly what I need here. And then the story goes on, but we can tell that throughout the talk, otherwise I'll spend the next 45 minutes telling the full story. So,
no, absolutely.
So that was the research, basically.
So, David, do you use like incident data for your work-related stuff? Like, how do you use it? Why do you need this information?
Yeah, so at my previous company, I moved like 2 months or so ago. What we used it for was for all sorts of different types of reporting. We used it at the first time to actually get a grip of what we as an incident response team were seeing in terms of, you know, how many incidents are we seeing across our different customer base. And then over time, we adapted more and more of the VERIS language into what we were doing. And we started to use it for, you know, VP reporting taking it to the CISO and saying that, you know, we're seeing a rise in social engineering over here against these specific users. And that was the other cool thing, right? Was that because we had made so many metrics of basically every single parameter, we could kind of say, okay, well, I want to know what's going on in social engineering and this area of the company. And then when you can do that, then you can really, really kind of take it to the next level, because then you can really start to look at, well, if I tweak something here in terms of doing more targeted social engineering training, can that have an effect? And then you can actually watch it over time, especially if you're recording, as we went a bit crazy and we tried to kind of adopt not just the full VERIS language, but then also add our own fields in as well. It looked a bit crazy at the start, but actually over time, we kind of got more used to using it, and it became a really, really powerful tool. And now in my new job as a consultant, I have this dream that I'm going to help organizations to actually do this. So basically, I want every organization to be able to produce their own DBIR, which shouldn't be so difficult, but yeah, let's see how we got on with that one. It's quite a journey as well. I think that was the reason why I wanted to give the SANS talk, was because it is a journey, right? You can't just you can't walk into an organization and say, you're using VERIS, here's a spreadsheet, off you go. You need to kind of, you know, a lot of the incident responders are used to being an incident responder for incident response sake and not for the organization's sake, right? If you walk into most places where they've got their own incident response team, they're really, really eager to get right down into the, you know, reversing of malware or doing all of those like really super technical stuff. They're not so bothered about how that is then communicated back into the business. And so it is a journey that you need to then kind of massage those guys. And then once you've got those guys to understand the value, then things can start to change. So, yeah. Did I answer the question, or did I talk way too much as always?
No, you did answer. And Suzanne, so Suzanne is the founder of the Digital Forensic Association. And when you initially founded this organization, did you know about VERIS, or were you aware?
No, not at all. This was before I joined Verizon, and before I was even really looking at data breaches. Actually, my first foray into looking at data breaches was when I was going for a PhD, and it was one of the projects was you had to do some sort of research in security. It was before the first DBIR had come out, and I started looking at publicly disclosed data breaches and doing some research in that area. And that was what started me off there. And at the time I was doing forensics as well. That's why I started the DFA.
Okay. John, you want to continue?
Sure. Just my experience, I've been with the team for 11 years for Verizon, and almost as long as the DBIR, but the VERIS came out, I think, Suzanne, was it 2013, 2014? Is that when it came out?
I think it was sooner than that.
Okay. And I started realizing as I was presenting the DBIR findings that folks were asking more and more questions about VERIS and the underlying framework that we use. And so a few years ago, I started switching up the presentations and talking more from the standpoint of VERIS, and in particular, the A4 threat model, which we're going to get into here real shortly. So my experience with it with VERIS was from the standpoint of relaying the findings in DBIR in a more structured manner from the standpoint of VERIS. And of course, with our delivery, we often do highlight findings with VERIS in mind, or at least the incident patterns, for example, or the A4 threat model in terms of some of our reporting, so that folks have a reference point and can compare and contrast to the DBIR and its findings. So that's my experience there. And let me go ahead and click on to the next slide here. We do have something we wanted to show and share before we start talking about the A4 threat model. Suzanne, did you want to kind of walk us through this,
Sure.
this tool that people can use?
So this is what we call the VERIS web app. And what we have is basically a web form where you can go through and answer all of the fields. And when you finish, you export it and it spits out the JSON file for you. It only exports it to your own desktop. It does not share it with anybody. And so if you want to share it, you actually have to send them that file. And so everything stays local. And it's really useful if you're coding a case and you don't want to, you don't know how to get started with JSON. You don't want to edit JSON. You just want to, fill out a form. And this is basically what it lets you do. And I believe at the end, we also have a slide that has where you can get this and make it useful for you. So yeah, hopefully that's something that people will use as sort of an entryway into recording their own data.
So essentially, there's two options, and correct me if I'm wrong. There's using this web app here to code data. We use it for the VERIS community database to code publicly disclosed breaches, but organizations can also leverage this internally for their purposes. Mm-hmm. So this is one way, and I think there's another way that folks sometimes use VERIS in terms of maybe a spreadsheet to track that way. Are those the primary two ways that you see folks using or inputting data or collecting data? Okay.
Typically, it's one of those two.
Do you mind just kind of touching on this screenshot here for folks to just kind of roll through from the top down to the bottom, and then we'll get more into the 4As there.
Sure. So basically, some of this is auto-generated by the app. The master ID and the incident ID are both internal fields that are generated by the app. And then, it's a drop-down security incident. It's, is this confirmed as a security incident, or is it suspected or something like that? And then, the reference will depend if you have case titles or something like that, you can put that in there. Then you have a summary, that if it's something that they're sending to us, we ask them to put a good summary in there so that we could conceivably, code the whole case based on the summary. There's enough information in there. Our confidence intervals, of course, is whether we have high confidence in what it was, and that's going to depend largely on what the source was. And then these other fields, timeline and victim, if you click on them, they actually expand quite a bit, and you get to put all the detail in there, and then you can collapse it and go on down the way. And it takes out the 4As, it takes out all the other little things that we collect in VERIS, and it makes it sort of an easier to present way of doing it.
Okay, and one other thing too, I think we didn't really talk too much about this, but there is a difference between incidents and breaches. Can you just kind of touch on that at a high level?
Sure. So the difference in the DBIR in particular between an incident and a breach is, for something to be considered a confirmed data breach, it has to be a confirmed violation of the confidentiality aspect of the data. And so you can probably think of, cases where you can't make that confirmation. For instance, the lost laptop, you don't have control over the asset anymore. You can't verify that the data was actually accessed. It's at risk because it's not encrypted, or would not be considered at risk in our data set. And so that would be considered a security incident and not a confirmed data breach. And so that's one of those things that, anything except the confirmed confidentiality is going to be a security incident.
Okay, thanks. It's good to know, because I always focus on the breaches, but of course the incidents are the greater data set, and those could be denial of service attacks that weren't a breach, or maybe a breach that wasn't fully fulfilled. So lots of good insight there in terms of the differences. So thank you.
Yeah, and if you look at like our report this year, we went through almost 80,000 security incidents, and we only boiled that down to just over 5,200 confirmed data breaches. So that's quite a difference in numbers.
Absolutely, absolutely. So A4 threat model, VERIS, A4 threat model is the full title there. Of course, we went over what VERIS stands for, and also the A4 threat model, but this is just a real quick refresher as we get into all four of these A's for today's discussion. And then we'll start talking about some of the significant incidents or media reported incidents that have occurred recently, and show how you can use VERIS to share that information and actually visualize it as well. One other thing too, and this is on veriscommunity.net, if you are collecting the data for VERIS, you can also use the VERIS A4 grid. And Suzanne, let me go ahead and have you comment on how this can be used in terms of tracking data, visualizing data, and seeing where the hotspots are in terms of what's happening.
Yeah, usually when we put something like this up, we put it up as a heat map so that you can sort of see where the hotspots are. And that tends to be how people use this, is to just see where their own hotspots are, because you want to know where you've got a concentration of incidents and breaches.
And this is on the left-hand side would be, you can see the assets and the attributes. And then on the bottom, you can see the actors and the actions. So those two go hand in hand in terms of the A4 threat model. David, is this anything that you've actually used in practice? Is this something that you can comment on?
Kind of, sort of, I guess.
Okay.
I actually didn't know that this existed. This is actually really awesome.
Okay.
And if I had have known this existed, then this would have been something that we used, I think, because we kind of created something like this of our own, where we, so maybe we have to go back a tiny bit first to the previous bit where we were talking about how to collect data as an organization yourself. Suzanne, you talked about the two usual methods of the JSON way, or using the web app, or using a spreadsheet. And that's what we started out with. Actually, originally we started out with a whiteboard where we talked first about trying to find the various fields that we felt were the most valuable for us and for our organization. And so we spent a lot of time as a team whiteboarding incidents in VERIS, and choosing sub fields of VERIS that we thought, okay, these are the most important to start out with, and then we can add the others later. And then we boiled it down to a spreadsheet with different tabs in the spreadsheet, for the different things. So actions had a tab, and then over time we kind of iterated that as well, where then we joined actions onto things like onto assets, so we could actually see when an action had occurred on an asset, and we also added other stuff into it. And that gave us kind of over time the ability to then be able to do things like this A4 thing, where we could actually then see, okay, if we look at social engineering, where are we seeing the biggest issues? this is a really nice way of doing it. And I think you do use this this grid and the DBIR, right? I think in quite a lot of things. I've actually started using the DBIR in some of my presentations that I go and give out either at universities or also when I go to client meetings where I look at, specifically start out the DBIR is like the perfect place to start if you're going to go to a talk with a client in a sector that you're not so familiar with. The DBIR is the perfect place to go, choose the the industry they're in, and then start from there. Where should I then be focusing? Okay, if there's a a higher proportion of if the gap between incidents and breaches is smaller, then that there's probably somewhere where there's needing more investment in this area, because most incidents are being turned into breaches, and so it's a really valuable tool for that, and these heat maps are super awesome for that as well.
Absolutely. And just to comment here, those numbers that folks see, it may be hard to see. There are 315 different combinations of A4 that fit within this grid. Essentially, there's 3 actors, 7 actions, 7 assets, and 3 attributes in various different combinations here to reflect the heat map here. So I was going to move on to the next slide. Is anything Suzanne or Nilofer on the A4 grid?
Nope, that pretty much takes care of it, I think.
Okay. All right, so actors, here's the 3 actors. Do you mind giving us an overview here, Suzanne? Maybe you can describe it best.
Sure. So someone who is external is going to be someone who has no affiliation at all with your organization. One of the things that people misunderstand about our framework here is that VERIS is an actor-centric framework, not a data location-centric framework. And so when people say, oh, your research says that the partner actors breaches are low, but in this other report it says they're high, and it's because for it to actually be a partner actor breach in our data set, it has to be someone who works for that partner doing the malicious actions, not or committing an error, which also happens, not necessarily that the person external to the partner attacked them and got your data because it was at the partner. So that's sort of the differentiator in the way VERIS works, as far as where the data is not as important as who is actually doing the actions. And so a partner is going to be, there is some kind of business relationship between your company and that partner. And then if the person doing the action works for them, that would be a partner action. Internal, of course, is someone who works for you, whether it's as a contractor or as a employee, doesn't really matter that much. Because they're still granted access to, be able to do their jobs. And so they're an internal actor.
Can you expand on internal too, to clarify that it's not necessarily insider threat per se when we look at
because you've got not only malicious actions, you've got error actions. And far and away, we have more error actions than we have people actually doing something malicious. And they can be harder to combat because people will make mistakes. So you have to find a way to combat it.
One of the things here too, and let me click on the next slide. This is just an excerpt from the veriscommunity.net, is for each of the 4 A's, they are types at the higher level: actors, actions, assets, and attributes. And this gives you an idea here of what is defined underneath VERIS framework. The left-hand side, this is the actor external variety, and on the right-hand side is the actor internal variety. So you can see there's multiple different varieties that are subsets to the external and internal, and they're further defined here. So it's clear, or a lot more clear in terms of what each one of these are by virtue of their definition. It helps folks with coding within the VCDB and within their own organization. Any other thoughts here, David or Suzanne, with the varieties?
Yeah. So one of the things that that I really love about this framework is the fact that you can do this internal part, because it allows you to almost kind of be able to get a grip on technical debt, but be able to visualize technical debt, right? So if you're seeing a lot of internal errors in a specific area, you can then start to focus on why is that happening. And one of the things that I was I was quite proud of actually managing to achieve at my previous company was that we weren't just using VERIS as a framework in the security area. We actually got VaRS adopted for the whole company. So the whole organization would then begin to start to use VaRS to describe their incidents, because in that regard, then you could suddenly take VaRS from being a security related framework into basically being an organization's framework, right? So if you were able to then use VaRS to track, because why should the security team have their own language and then the other area have like an ITIL driven language that's still archaic and built by people working in that area? Why can't we have it across the board and then use VaRS to record and track the internal issues as well? Because there will be internal errors that of course you still have that security incident flag, right? There's that gets set, whatever else, but there will be still internal errors that are happening all the time that you could keep track of using VaRS. And so that was actually one of the things that we were quite happy about. It took a long time. It took actually I think we've been using the framework for almost a year when we then approached the rest of the organization and said, look, hey, could this be something that could work for you guys? We managed to get time with we just hired a really great data scientist, and she'd come in and she was seeing the organization and was just like, okay, I've got to get a grip on all of this stuff. And I gave her an hour presentation of all the reporting we've been doing and our monthly trend analysis and all this other stuff, and she was just like, whoa, like someone here actually understands data science and how to do this stuff. Like, could you be my flag bearer for why we need to do this? And yeah, so we managed to we hadn't got it fully implemented when I left, but I'm kind of hoping that it's carried on, because it is really powerful when you even just look at the internal part. I know a lot of people see VaRS as external a lot of the time, but actually there's a lot of internal stuff that's really worth recording. So that was just to drop that in as a kind of an extra thing. It doesn't necessarily always have to be a security framework. It can be, if you want it to be a success in your organization, you could really go the whole hog and say, well, what am I actually really using in my operational incident area? Am I really using a very worthwhile language over there? Could I simply just stop doing whatever I'm doing here where maybe I'm not having so much success and just adopt VaRS, because you still have most of the same stuff that you need in VaRS, and then just add some of the additional fields that you don't have. So yeah.
That's a good point, using VaRS in terms of the use case that you just illustrated, but also the other aspect, and you mentioned this earlier in the call, is expanding VaRS. There's ways to expand VaRS. There's aspects of VaRS that are there already established, but you can also build onto it and use it for your tailored particular instance.
Yeah, I mean, we used we added quite a few fields to describe different things. We also added we had I'm going to drop an acronym here, a SOA tool, the Security Orchestration Automation Response tool. And that we decided that we wanted to add a field for containment actions, because we wanted it to also be a kind of we wanted the language to be something we could track an ongoing incident, whilst we were actually in the live incident response case. Could we also then, when we add assets into the table, then we would add next to them whether we'd actually done containment, so that then at the end, when we come to do the final remediation, it's all already registered. And then we go in and see, okay, these were the ones that we actually, blocked in whatever tool, and these are the ones we've got to then eradicate. So we added quite a few different fields to kind of make it a bit more operational as well. And then the one that really got people's attention when I gave the SANS talk earlier in the year, which I didn't really expect, was we added two additional ones that were really, really popular, which was the malware variant stuff. So we added in the malware families into VaRS, where we had like plus dot, and then the different variants. And then we also added some MITRE ATT&CK We only added, the high-level MITRE attack, not the in-depth stuff, because I've seen some who have tried to combine them, and it is a task because VaRS gets updated and MITRE gets updated, and they get updated at different points, so it can get a bit messy. Yeah, we extended with high-level MITRE and malware variants, and then I got loads of people afterwards writing to me on Twitter like, "Hey, I heard you combined VERIS and malware families. How did you do that?" And I was like, "You just make a dictionary of the stuff you want to add in, and then that's it. You're done." But the MITRE one was the one that got quite a lot of attention, and maybe that's something we could just quickly talk about here, because there was a project, and I don't know who, Suzanne, if you know this, that there was something going on with a combination of VERIS and MITRE, and I can't remember the name of it. You had an acronym for it.
Yeah, it was VCAF, and it's still ongoing as a research project with MITRE.
Okay, cool.
There it is.
No, it's here. Perfect. Look at that. Cool. Yeah,
the nice thing about VERIS is we do have our plus section where you can just add whatever fields you need, and so it's quite useful that way. One of the things I did want to bring up in this is, you were mentioning when there's errors and other kinds of internal things that go on that may not be your traditional security incidents. We do also have an impact section and a lot of fields where you can measure, if you have that information, the kind of impact it's had to your organization, and so it sort of gives more of a grounding for your finance folks of what's going on in that space as well. So it can be quite useful too.
Sure. So Suzanne, what about who puts this data in, and say SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, all the other which have come up? How is this data put into the VERIS database? And what if it is put in twice, or who's responsible for putting it, or anybody can report this? And do you see double reporting of stuff?
So we use our GitHub repo for their issues list, where we put in the issues when we find new, and it's usually me, find new data breaches. So I try not to get duplicates. Sometimes we get duplicates. When we identify them, we put in a record, and it's removed from the database. But as far as anyone wanting to code cases, we do have a process for that. You basically have to contact us, and we can walk you through it. We also have a bunch of training materials. So if anyone wants to code cases for the VERIS Community Database project, we would very much welcome them. And you would be using the web app that we showed you.
Call to action. Action. So speaking of which, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the question that Laufer had, here's an example here of the actors. Do you mind walking us through this flow chart here to show how to code or decide who the actor is?
Sure, and it may be a little hard for you to see, or at least it is for me, so I've got it up over here too. So determining the actor is basically a series of decisions. Does the person who caused the breach work for the victim organization? If they do, that's an internal actor. If they don't, you have to ask, is there a business relationship between the organization that was the victim and the organization that the person worked for? If there's no business relationship, then they are an external actor. If there is, then they are a partner actor, and that's pretty much, what it is who they work for.
One question, if it's a former employee, do they get coded as external or internal? That's external.
Yeah, once they're former, they should not still have access. Of course, that should word gets us into trouble all the time. But yeah, it means that their access should have been shut off when they were no longer an employee, and it changes the actions and how we classify them.
Okay. Speaking of actions, 7 action types. There's some nuances here behind some of them. I know error, for example, is not necessarily going to have a motive. Misuse is going to be tied to a couple of the actor types. Any high-level insight that you can provide for us in terms of this, Suzanne?
So error actions are by definition an internal or partner actor. They are not an external actor making a mistake and somehow causing a breach. Misuse is going to be an internal or partner actor, and it is going to be malicious actions. So that's the sort of caveats between those two. And then most of the others here, pretty much all of them, are going to be external actors, and they can be in concert with internal actors. We do have collusion in some cases. And so that's one of the important distinctions. You can have multiple actions, you can have multiple assets, you can have multiple actors, and you can have multiple attributes that are affected in all of these incidents at the same time. It does not have any kind of exclusionary requirements, because the real world does not have those requirements.
What are some examples of physical? I can think of a couple, but what are some of the typical ones you see?
The most common is theft. So, stolen laptops, stolen thumb drives, stolen papers even. And then the other most common is tampering, and that tends to be your ATM skimmers and other kinds of things where they actually put some kind of physical device to interfere or to listen in on what's going on.
And earlier in January, the U.S. Capitol Hill attack, that was physical with a cyber component, correct?
Yep, that was. Yeah, that was an interesting case to code up. And we actually did. So we have this thing called VERIS volumes, where we code up a case that's in the news with as much information at the time as we have, and we release an article about it and sort of walk people through how you would code the case up. And it's been well received so far, so that's good. We did that case. We've done Colonial Pipeline, and I think was there another one? I don't remember.
The pipeline, SolarWinds, which we'll show an example of, and pipeline, and then the U.S. Capitol Hill. Those are the three that I recall. So
yeah.
Hey, John. So suppose just now I've seen examples of misconfigured cloud services impacting security. Example is that databases are not password protected, no formal authentication process in place, and then they got discovered and got reported. Where would that show up in this? Where would it show up in?
And it would be an error category in terms of how it's, because it's misconfiguration.
Yeah.
There's various different varieties for error, but that particular one would be the misconfiguration variety.
Okay, thanks.
So, no,
and we see that paired with the discovery method of security researcher on a regular basis.
Exactly.
And the security researcher, correct me if I'm wrong, could be an academic or could be somebody that's in that kind of a field in terms of the services they offer, where they're identifying the misconfiguration or maybe even a vulnerability and reporting it to the victim.
Yes, first they report to the victim, and then they report it to the press, typically.
And the bug bounty hunters, do they fall under that category?
No, they're not usually finding data, they're finding vulnerabilities.
Okay.
Sometimes, I mean, if they do a get access, then that can wind up being a breach anyway, but usually those are not as widely reported because they're interested in getting paid by the company that's the victim and not necessarily just getting the notoriety.
But what concerns me is the fact that a security researcher is going to report it to the victim company, but there might be others who might have had access and we never know about those.
Exactly, and you hear people who complain about the security researchers finding this data, but really you'd rather they find it and make that notification than, some hacker who finds it and just sells the data on the dark web 12 times over. So yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of resentment towards them, but by the same token, I'd really rather they found my data and told the company to take it down.
So this is a coding example here, ransomware confirmed breach. You can see the JSON file name at the top there. And this is just visually showing the particular incident through the VERIS perspective or lens with the A4 threat model. And I know that, like David, when you were going over examples there for the SAN CTI Summit, you were showing how you could take just an article with a lot of verbiage, several paragraphs, and pull out key terms and then code it into VERIS and extract something that you need to read to something that you could potentially have either within the VERIS framework or a visual here that Suzanne put together. And that was I think that was very effective to show the power behind VERIS and how you can take something that someone would require a lot of time to read and put it into simple terms within the framework. I do recall that from your session.
Yeah, and I used that example actually to also kind of show the comparisons between the kind of the more purpose-built when I say purpose-built, of course, VaRS was built for a purpose, but the ones that were, when I say purpose-built, I mean the ones that were kind of built just to satisfy a very singular purpose. And that, as I said, I'll do that disclaimer again. No disrespect to Circle or any of those guys and the ones that they've created. They created theirs and it suits them perfectly for what they need it for. But I did use those examples to try and show how limited you would be if you used I don't know, the one that Anissa are working on. Anissa are working on a language at the moment. They have a working group that keeps starting and then pausing and starting and then pausing and starting and then pausing. But I used this exact example to kind of show, here's a long piece of text with a long set of, this person is hit by ransomware or whatever it was. I think it was Molly from HR, I think was her name. And I think I talked about Qbot, and I tried to show kind of when you have this incident that's happened, and then you try and map it into this language, how does it look? And you try and map it into this language, how does it look? And then finally you map it into VaRS, and then everything is perfect. And I think actually, Suzanne, one thing I would like to also add on was one of the realizations that we came to really quickly was, for a very long time, we had been like registering cases as a social engineering case, or as this was before we got into VaRS, right? So as a social engineering case, or as a DDoS case or something else like that. And what you just mentioned is exactly right, that a case doesn't just have to have a singular attack method, right? We were using attack method to basically define what a case was. And actually, it took a long time to be able to convince people not to use that method, because what if you have multiple attack methods in the same case? What is then the defining factor over the top? And I was like, well, it's, what's actually happened. It's a security incident. That's basically almost your defining factor. You have a case ID. That's your factor. You have an impact, or you have a CIA breach, whatever you have. Those are the ones that are your factors. And then you can have multiple types of attacks that have happened. And you can also have multiple actors. You can have, as all of these lovely things down here. And that was kind of one of the things that took a long time to convince people, because suddenly when we were doing it, things like the number of social engineering cases that we were registering before we started with VERIS versus after dropped a tiny bit, simply because we've been registering them as, singular things. We'd maybe see one incident where we'd have like 6 users that were social engineered, and that would actually, before we moved to VERIS, would have been 6 individual incidents, whereas with VERIS it was actually 1, because it was the same thing that happened to all of them. It was the same incident overall. So that was also another kind of interesting thing about VERIS, that you had these multiple actors, multiple attacks. Everything is kind of a metric inside the case. So yeah.
And I skipped here to coding example 2, because this is the SolarWinds case coding that Suzanne can go over with us, but it's kind of like the same thing here, where this is one incident. It's not hundreds or thousands. It's one incident. It's a little bit along the same lines of what you're talking about, David, in terms of multiple attack vectors, except this is more. Actually, let me hand it over to Suzanne to kind of walk through this one, kind of explain how this one is not multiple incidents. It's one complete incident, as far as we can tell with what's been disclosed.
Yeah, sure. So if you're not familiar, SolarWinds is an incident that had a whole lot of victims because they compromised the partner that handled IT infrastructure management for a lot of companies. And so you can see in the victim ID, we have a secondary field. And that's how we account for when the primary victim has to make all these reports to all of their customers that it was their data that was lost. And so then those customers have to tell the customers who the data was about, that their data was lost, and you get the secondary effect. And so our definition of sort of a secondary attack is when the attack on the original victim was just a stepping stone to get to some other infrastructure that they had access to, and to facilitate that kind of data. And so you can see we have just a ton of victim IDs under secondary with, FireEye and the U.S. courts and all these cities and hospitals and universities and everybody else. And it starts for the attributes. It starts with, we've got confirmed data disclosure, certainly. We know that the data variety they accessed initially was the code base. And the variety we have for integrity violation is software installation. We didn't have any kind of ransomware or anything, so that wasn't an availability violation. We did not ever get the discovery method that I know of. We know that they were external actors. They were state affiliated from what we can tell, and their motive is, again, secondary because they were trying to get to all of the customers via this partner. And the actions that we have here are hacking. We don't know how they got in. We just know it was a hacking, and we don't know, the vector. We don't know if it was a web app or what it was. And we try very hard not to speculate and infer. We try to only put in there what we know to be true. We know that there was malware. The reports are indicating that they had a backdoor, that there was command and control going on as well, and that the actor installed it after they had access, so they directly installed it. We know that the assets at a minimum included their code repository and their mail server, just based on what we found out later. And so the last thing here we like to do is we like to get our event chain. So you have sort of a timeline of how the attack happens, and you can look at then the steps that are in the beginning of attacks, what steps are in the middle, and what steps are in the end of attacks, to sort of give you a you are here if you see just one of them by themselves. And so our first event was hacking by an external actor on a server asset. We don't know the attribute that they compromised with that, because we don't know for sure what that variety was, but they gained access with it. The next event is that they had the malware installed, and then that was the integrity violation, again, against the server. And then the third event was when the actor took the code repository information and stole that data. Now, the other thing they do, we know, is that they modified the code repository to push out their malware to the customers. And we had a lot of debate on the team about whether this was another event. But in reality, we finally decided that since this is the way that infrastructure is supposed to work, that it pushing out the automatic update was not another event. It was just part of the code compromise instead. And so that's the way the SolarWinds incident shapes up here.
So I think it's all about VERIS is reflecting the incidents and breaches. It's very focused on that, and not so much, not too much into the actor realm, but it's more incident focused. Not too much into specific flavors of malware, but it's incident focused. Is that kind of the best way to describe?
Yeah, I mean, you have a lot of fields. You can put the depth of information you have in there if you want to. Usually when someone starts out with VERIS, just the sheer volume of things they can record tends to be a bit overwhelming. And so we tell people, just start at this higher level and get comfortable with that. And then as you go on, if you find there's certain areas you want to expand it, then, go ahead and do so. And whether that's by, using the plus fields, or if it's, like VCAF or something like that to map it to another framework, then whatever works for you.
The link, I know this is going to be a shameless self-promotion, but the link for the SANS talk that I gave earlier in the year, actually, I think really kind of talks about from an early perspective in terms of what the journey that you can go on if you want to adopt this type of thing. So I really think that could be valuable as well.
Okay, I will definitely share it, David.
It's on
Susan,
YouTube.
I have a question.
Well.
So initially, based on whatever we know today, this, say you were talking about this SolarWinds, right? And then maybe 3 months down the line, you realize oh, what about this? So there's additional information which is available. So do we update it, or how does it work? How do you go in and update that old record that you had, or how would you?
So actually, when we're going to update a record that's in the data set, we actually pull it up in the web app, because you can go in there and you can import, and you can pull in the JSON file. You just go and select it, and then you can make your changes, and you can export it again, and out into the repo it goes with the updated one. So yeah, that's how we handle it. Okay. And every time we find new information, usually, especially Down the line, it winds up being new impact information as these things go through the courts, especially, you wind up with lawsuits and that sort of thing, or there's regulatory fines or something like that. So whenever we get that information, we will put in an update record to go in and update those records and include that.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I just wanted to touch real quick. Folks are probably asking about the assets. There are 7 asset types, and Suzanne kind of covered it with the example there with SolarWinds. People are assets, but we primarily, I would say, have to say that we see servers, people, and user devices most of the time for the breaches and the incidents. Any other comments here in terms of assets, Suzanne?
The other one we do see is media, which would be including paper and documents, and when they lose hard drives, or when it used to be they were always losing tapes or CDs. That's all in media.
Yeah. Good point. And then you mentioned the CIA triad here, the confidentiality, and integrity, and availability, which folks should be familiar with. Confidentiality, by very definition for breaches, is impacted 100% of the time. I've noticed that availability seems to be higher for the incidents, such as denial of service attacks, than it is for breaches. Any other thoughts there in terms of the CIA triad?
Just that, when people question why we have people as assets, it's because you have an integrity violation when they are falling for a social attack that is alter behavior. And that accounts for them falling for whatever social attack it was, whether it was a phishing or something in person or whatever it was.
And we actually saw the alter behavior step over software installation as top integrity variety for breaches this year in terms of the DBIR data set.
Yeah, social attacks are on the rise, definitely.
One more example here, and this perhaps is interesting because it's the most recent big media event here, the Colonial Pipeline case coding, and set up very similar to the SolarWinds that we went over a little bit earlier. And any other comments or thoughts in terms of maybe what's different here between Colonial Pipeline case and coding and the SolarWinds? Anything else?
Well, it actually is an example of a record that's been updated since we originally coded it. And this diagram, I also updated it because I knew we were going to be talking about it. When it first came out, we weren't sure how they got in. It turns out that was a hacking use of stolen credentials. And so instead of the unknown action, we've got that in there now. And we do know that, of course, ransomware was deployed against the database, and they shut it down because they were concerned that it had gotten into their billing system and they weren't going to be able to tell who they should bill for what as far as the gas that was delivered. And it's interesting because it got a lot of attention because it really affected critical infrastructure, and especially on the East Coast, it had real impact to the public, where there were suddenly lines for people who wanted to get gasoline, or they had additional hops on airplane rides so that they could actually go a shorter distance so they could refuel outside of the area that was affected, and so it got a lot of attention. But it really is largely just a standard ransomware attack. I don't think that. Oh yeah, so they weren't doing the ransomware name and shame thing, so they weren't threatening to release their data, but they did have data disclosure because they got in using stolen credentials. So that was where we got the confidentiality aspect. Here we have the software installation, which is the malware, and the encryption was triggered, which gives you obscuration as your availability once you can no longer look at your data. And of course, actor disclosure is the discovery method when there is a ransomware attack, because they find out when that lovely ransom note pops up. And it is attributed to organized crime, and dark side is the name of the group. I'm sorry?
I also noticed too, for the discovery method with the actor disclosure, that when you go to our interactive website for the DBIR, the top discovery method for breaches this year is actually external actor disclosure. Can you kind of talk about that? Is that just purely ransomware, or are there other types of actor disclosures that fall in that category?
There are other kinds of actor disclosures, although ransomware is the most common. You also get what I've been sort of calling the hacking name and shame activity now, where it's not so much the triggering ransomware, but they steal a copy of your data and then they threaten you again with disclosure of the data. sort of as leverage to get you to pay up. And so we've seen that more often since the change in tactics with the ransomware as well. And it's just one of those things where, you know, if you have to wait for the person who's attacking you to tell you that you've been attacked, then you probably have some work to do in your security.
Good point.
John, I have two questions. So
Absolutely.
one is that suppose like there is a ransomware on my infrastructure and it becomes unavailable to me. Should I just presume like that they have a copy of everything that was available with me? Or, I mean, because, I mean, why should I not assume that, you know, they already have a copy of everything when, you know, they have already, this thing basically breached my security and they are in my environment?
Well, ransomware incidents have become more and more breaches, in particular since 2018. If you look at the DBIR, where the threat actors are indeed, as Suzanne illustrated, exfiltrating the data as a backup option in case the victim does not pay the ransom to decrypt or unlock the files. They can now go back and say, hey, I've exfiltrated the data. So if there's a ransomware incident, you want to check and see if there was potential exfiltration by that same threat actor to see what you're up against, because it may not just be ransomware, it may also be a data exfiltration event.
Okay, second question is that, and this is like what I've heard from people, that companies get this email saying within 30 minutes, if you do not pay, so like this ransom, we will launch a DDoS attack against your like whatever public facing website or whatever business related website or some like internet connected, what should I say, internet connected websites are available for your business. How will that get coded? Because this is not, they've not like, no confidential information was accessed or something, or does it not get?
It would be coded as an availability. If they actually launch the attack, it's an availability violation. So it's not going to be a data breach, but it's a security incident. And we do see a lot of that. And certainly it's a good idea if you have web-facing presences that you rely on to do business, that you have some kind of DDoS mitigation in place.
Okay, all right, thanks. Yeah, please go ahead, John.
Actually, this was just the way forward. I know we're at the top of the hour. I wanted to click through a couple more slides here just real quick, and then if it's okay, go round robin for any final thoughts that people may have. So we talked about the MITRE ATT&CK framework in terms of VCAF previously to map VERIS to at least 12 of the 14 techniques found within the MITRE ATT&CK. But in terms of the cyber defenders, we also map VERIS to the syscontrols version 8. There are 18 controls now, so we are mapped within the DBIR, and you see an example here, figure 140 for implementation group 3. There's 3 implementation groups within the version 8 syscontrols, so we do have that mapped as well for the countermeasures of the cyber defender realm, cybersecurity realm. So not only are we mapping incidents and breaches within VERIS, but we're also mapping VERIS to 2 other industry standards, the syscontrols here that you can see, as well as the VCAF. And I wanted to...
Can I ask a question about the sys one quickly?
Yes.
Does that mean that you're basically saying, if you take the Colonial Pipeline incident, right, you'd be basically saying that in order to do better next time, you should be looking into these categories in the syscontrols because this is where they were failures. Is that what you're basically saying?
Yes. So basically what we're doing is we're trying to provide people with some kind of roadmap. So if they look at the breakdown of the 9 patterns into their respective incidents, they see what they're most likely to be hit with. And then if they look at this, we've got the 9 patterns into the controls that are good for combating them. And that gives them a here, this is how you get there. We map it to all 3 of the implementation groups. So regardless of where you're starting from, it gives you a place to go. And as your security maturity increases, then you can apply other implementation groups that build on that.
This is really awesome. Actually, I did not know about this. This is actually going to quite largely improve the work that I also do. Actually, knowing about this one.
Good.
This is really exciting. Is there other stuff like, I know I'm going to sound like a consultant now, but things like the have you looked at the NIST cybersecurity framework and stuff like that? Is that is that a possible one that could be added on at some point in the future?
I believe we did
someone to do the mapping then.
Yeah, we've mapped to various frameworks over time, and I believe at one point we did map to that as well. It would be in an older version of the report to sort of take a look at, and it probably needs some kind of updating by now. But it's one of those things that we try to do to sort of help people sort of figure out, the so what about our research is how do I use this? How do I implement it? And this is part of it. The other thing that you'll probably find useful is we actually identified the top 4 controls of all of the patterns that were common in the most of them. And so if you don't know where to start, those 4 controls would probably be a really good place.
And those are SIS 4, 5, 6, and wherever the training one is, 14.
Yeah.
14.
Yeah.
And also to add on there, the SIS version 8 controls are also mapped now on to the NIST cybersecurity framework. You can get that at syssecurity.org. Just download it there. It's a spreadsheet where it's mapped in that regard. So it would go from VERIS to SIS controls to NIST cybersecurity framework. Yeah. So.
Okay, thank you so much. John, do you have another slide that you want to talk about?
I don't, but I wanted to see, it's up to you, Nilofer, if we have time to see if we can go round robins for any final comments that people may have.
Yeah, sure. So if anybody has any question, please put them in the question box Q&A tab. And Susan, we can probably start with you.
So in addition to this, we actually have our repo actually has the graphics that we use in our report, that we put out high-res versions of them. So if you want to use graphics from our reports in any of your presentations, you can just go and grab good ones from them, and that'll be in the VaRS repository, I believe, or it might be DBIR, but it's in that family. Once you're in the repositories that are surrounding this, you should be able to find it without too much trouble.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming and discussing this VERIS with us and walking us through the different slides. David, thank you so much. I know it's like almost close to midnight or probably even in the next day. But thank you for staying with us and agreeing to join us. Do you have any parting tips or?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you very much, guys, for having me. It's a real pleasure to kind of be alongside some of the guys that I really look up to as well. But I would say that VERIS should be looked at as a framework that you can also use yourself, right? It doesn't just have to be something that's in the DBIR. I would say that organizations should just even try doing basic mappings of their own incidents and seeing how does it actually look. That you don't have to, as Suzanne has already said, you don't have to use all of the fields or anything else. You can choose a subselection of them. You can even go online and use the app. You can build your own spreadsheet, however you want to do it. Just get started with it. And I think that hopefully we're on that kind of next step now where people might start looking at this area, because for a long time it's been an area where there hasn't really been very much movement from an organization standpoint, right? The guys at Verizon have created this awesome DBIR where they actually show off how to use the language, but for some reason there's a lot of organizations that haven't just taken this step into, well, how do I apply data science to my incidents? And here you have a framework that's basically ready just to be pulled off the shelf and adapted how you want to use it. So I guess that my parting words are, get on with it. And you will see the benefits, right? Like I use the DBIR in almost every day in what I do as well. Yeah, I try to get as much attention on it as well in the area that I'm in, because I think that more people need to start using it. So I hope, as I gave in my podcast that I did with Rick Holland recently, that I'm going to go back on his podcast in almost a year and talk about whether we've made any progress in getting organizations to also adopt the language. So it's going to be one of my focuses for my kind of extracurricular activities outside of work and inside of work to get more attention on it. I'm trying with the universities, right? That's actually where I'm trying to get, like, if I can get into some of the universities and get them to start thinking about this type of thing, then I think we have a shot at actually having more people start to because if you can have a student, and I'm sorry I'm using a lot of words right now, but if you take a student who is just going to start his cybersecurity career and he lands in an organization and he's already comes with this language with him, and says, well, why don't we start recording data like this, that student will just rocket into the organization. And so that's also kind of one of the ways that I'm trying to educate students into how they could also start using this. I've actually done it in a different way. I'm using a tool called Obsidian, which is a basic note-taking tool, but I use VERIS inside Obsidian now to show the links between different stuff. It's another way of just visualizing data, and it kind of helps the students to see how, and that's actually the most powerful thing about that one, is that you can then see the links between, you have 1 incident, 2 incidents, 3 incidents, you can then see the links between all the incidents like that without having to build a heat map or anything else. You can just draw, you just have this graph where you can just have physics and move them around. And that's where I'm trying to also get people to see that this isn't just about improving how you record 1 incident or 2 or 3, it's about visualizing all of your incidents. So yeah, I talked a lot there at the end, but it's something that I'm really, really excited about as well. So yeah, that's my parting words. And actually, really, I would say really great job, guys. That's one of the things that I know there's a lot of people write about it. But yeah, I know it's a really massive amount of hard work that goes into it. So, and also one last thing, soon, John, hopefully I'll receive my hard copy of this year's one, because I have a hard copy of last year's.
We haven't gotten ours yet. They haven't printed it yet.
You know, I gave the SANS talk, right? And I wrote to Galen, and I was like, please, you know, I would really, if you have any swag you can send me, I would love it. And then he was like, what's your address? And then literally like 2 days later, faster than the post arrives internally inside Denmark, showed up the hard copy of that book. And yeah, it's the book that I put behind my desk when I give talks. So yeah, thank you, guys.
One thing I did fail to mention was we do have the VERIS coding style guide, which is basically a manual of how to get started coding cases as well. And so it's got a lot of information on how to do that. So it's also on the slide there.
Sure. So John.
Yeah, so that's interesting that you brought that up, Suzanne, because a wise man once said to me, that was on the DBIR team, is if you really want to understand incidents, you need to code them via VERIS, because you'll look at them from a different perspective. And I certainly do look at the DBIR differently since I started looking at VERIS through the perspective of, for example, the A4 threat model. So encourage folks to get out there and learn about VERIS and see how you can adapt it, like the examples that David used in terms of adapting it to your environment. And I just wanted to say thanks, David, for being a great inspiration. It was impressive to see your SANS CTI Summit presentation. I had just gotten done presenting and was talking about VERIS from the standpoint of cyber espionage, and then I tuned into your session, was really excited to see how you walk through your decision-making process in terms of determining VERIS was the go-to model for you and your organization and your needs. And of course, Suzanne, all of the years that we've known each other, I do appreciate all the sagacious advice that you have behind the questions that I ask with VERIS, because I tend to come up with some interesting ones from the speaking engagements where people ask me those questions. So thank you for all that you've done. And most of all, thank you, Nilofer, for the opportunity to help pay it forward with what you've done with the community over many, many, many sessions like this.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know all of you are like super busy, but like to get everybody together and to volunteer your time and to pay back to our community, I really appreciate you doing it. Thank you so much. And until next time, see you.